everyone. Welcome to the February 18th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to take a look back at the President's Day weekend, 3 days of stakes racing that we saw on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday of this past week. The focus, of course, will be on the three-year-olds, as it has been for the past number of weeks since the year turned to 2020. We'll discuss those races from the fairgrounds, where they ran the two divisions of the Risen Star, the Southwest from Oaklawn Park, and we'll also mention some notable maiden and allowance performances from Santa Anita and Tampa Bay Downs. A little later in the show, we'll also discuss some undercard races from those two cards at Fairgrounds and Oaklawn Park, the General George card from Laurel Park, and a couple of stakes from Tampa. Craig, this is a week where I think a lot of people were turning to speed figures to kind of orient themselves and get some guidance, because some of the performances we saw on the racetrack were not the most visually impressive, I think you could say.
No, I would agree with that. Particularly, I assume we're going to start with the Risen Star here in a minute. The second division was really ugly. The first was just so-so, in my opinion. But, yeah, there wasn't anything too flashy on the three-year-old front until we got to the Southwest yesterday, which we'll talk about later. But that was a quick race, and actually the fastest one I think we've seen this year. So with that said, let's dive in and get talking about these races.
Yeah, let's go straight to those two divisions of the Risen Star. We'll begin with the first one, which was the 12th race at the Fairgrounds on Saturday. This was the faster division, as you mentioned, won by Mr. Monomoy. And it turns out that the top three finishers from the prep for this race, the Lecomte, they were the top three finishers in the Risen Star, just in a different order, as the third place finisher from the Lecomte turned the tables on the horses that finished ahead of him. Mr. Monomoy got the job done here in pretty decisive fashion. He set a moderate pace, but he held sway in the stretch and got the distance. The other two, Enforceable and Silver State, they ran well, but Mr. Monomoy just seemed to improve out of that stakes debut last time.
He did. He got a 110 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, which is solid enough. And this race is a good advertisement for the way we do our speed figures. He actually ran third last time in that Lecomte, but he got the same speed figure as the winner Enforceable and a better speed figure than the runner-up Silver State that day. And that was all because the pace was pretty hot and he was the closest one to it. And I think we both liked him on the forecast. And he backed it up. He ran well. He showed that the distance isn't a problem. 1 1/8 at this early stage. We don't often see that with three-year-olds in top-level competition. Didn't seem to be a problem as he was pulling away at the end. So if there's anything I can take from this one, it's that he can at least get the distance.
Yeah, it seems like Brad Cox has some promising three-year-olds right now. We'll talk about the Southwest in a little bit. But Mr. Monomoy, he's really improved, as we've mentioned many times before. He's got that pedigree that says he's supposed to be a nice horse, and he's finally delivering on that potential. As for the other two that finished just behind him, I thought Enforceable put in a pretty encouraging effort. The problem with Enforceable is that he's just not that quick out of the gate, and I think that really compromises him in a lot of these races, especially in races with large fields, because he finds himself towards the back of the pack, and he's actually a horse that travels in the bridle, and he gets pretty keen in his races. It's not like he's some sluggish, deep closing type. He just breaks a little bit slowly, and then Julien Labrousse sort of has to pick his way through the pack. I thought he made a nice middle move on the backstretch to get into the race. Just wasn't the sort of race that really set up for a deep closer, but he ran well, and he'll get better with added distance.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And he's a horse that he's just going to be pace dependent unless he can get rid of that habit of starting so slow, because without the fast pace he saw on the comp, he just wasn't able to make up that ground. But certainly not a bad effort. I thought Silver State was a little disappointing. He had every reason to be second and just couldn't hold off Enforceable late. So out of those two, I would definitely prefer Enforceable. There were no real excuses for Silver State in this one.
Yeah, I agree with that. I thought Silver State should have been second here. The others just didn't really show up with particularly compelling efforts. It's not like the pace totally held together. Mr. Monomoy was stalked by some horses, dropped away, one of them being Blackberry Wine, who did not run back to that impressive allowance win from the month prior. So I thought it was a fairly run race. The pace was on the moderate side, but I thought Mr. Monomoy was just the best horse.
Yeah.
Moving on to that other division, the second division of the Risen Star. This was the slower one, and we had talked about it a bit beforehand, that once you got past Anodor, who was the favorite in this race, there just was not the depth to the second division that you found in the first division, even though Anodor seemed to be the best horse that was running in either division of this race. Well, Anodor didn't show up with anything close to his best effort. I didn't see a post-race analysis or anything to suggest there was some excuse for him. I don't know what happened because he just did not run his race for whatever reason. And once you took him out of it, we just basically had a lot of maiden and allowance winners. It was kind of like a glorified nominators of one allowance race. And the two horses coming out of maiden victories finished first and second as Modernist went to the lead from his rail post position, stayed there for the entire race. Major Fed took a little bit of a run at him late, but just not a very fast race on the clock.
No, it wasn't. The winner only got a 105 TimeformUS speed figure, so 5 points slower than the first division. The pace wasn't noticeably slower. It was a little slower, but the half mile was pretty much the same, and it just got slower from there. So just not a good race. It wasn't a good race looking visually. I thought Major Fed looked like he was going to make a big run and just kind of hung. And then New York Traffic, who looked beat turning for home, somehow stuck around for third. So just not a very strong race at all. I think the first division was much stronger. The first four, at least in the first division, got at least a 105, which is what the winner got here. So this one to me is just a race I don't see a lot of promise going forward into bigger and better things.
And I saw some people saying that there was a rail bias or a speed bias on the dirt on Saturday at the fairgrounds. I mean, I think people are conflating the turf races and the dirt races in this situation, because we'll get to a turf race where a bias situation really was affecting results in a number of turf stakes on the fairgrounds card on Saturday. The dirt, though, I thought was fair. I mean, I think people just get to a point where they see one aberrant result, like Modernist winning this race at 12-1, riding the rail the entire way, and they try to retrofit some narrative to the other races on the card. But I don't think that's what happened. I just thought Modernist bested a pretty mediocre group in this race.
Yeah, I would agree. I went back and looked at all the dirt races because I saw the same chatter you did, and I was a little surprised by it. And I mean, when you look at all the races, there didn't appear to be any change in the track speed. So it was a consistent track from start to finish. And, I just don't see it. Plenty of horses were able to make a move outside. They were able to come from off the pace. So to me, I didn't see any kind of speed or rail bias.
Now, some people might argue that the best 3-year-old that we saw in action on the dirt on Saturday at the fairgrounds was actually a filly. Finite stepped forward and won the Grade 2 Rachel Alexandra just before those two divisions of the Risen Star. This was supposed to be her big matchup with last year's 2-year-old champion British Idiom, but it turns out that British Idiom was the one that didn't step forward, and Finite was the one that did. She ran by far the fastest speed figure of her career and just dominated this race after stalking 3 to 4 wide the entire way.
Yeah, I think she's a horse I'm going to have to come around to. I keep trying to beat her, and I keep getting beat. And there was just absolutely nothing to knock in this performance. She once again showed that good tactical speed that she always has. The pace was, fairly quick. It wasn't in red, but, I mean, it was quick enough early. It was honest, I'll say that. And she just kicked clear of everybody and won with a nice 108 TimeformUS speed figure, just a couple points lower than that first division of the Risen Star. So no knocks whatsoever on her. I guess you can give British Idiom a little bit of an excuse. She was wide on both the turns. It was her first race since the Breeders' Cup. And, she just didn't look all that good. Now, granted, she hadn't come in all that fast. Coming into the race, she didn't have all that fast a speed figure. So I'm not sure she's one you want to give too much of an excuse going forward. It might just be the others have caught up.
Yeah, I mean, it was her first start off a layoff, so I suppose she can improve from here. She was a little bit sluggish away from the gate as Finite outbroke her and just basically shut the door on her pretty quickly, forcing her to come from maybe a little bit farther off the pace than Javier Castellado might have preferred. But still, Finite just ran the much better race. And as you were saying, I think she's a horse that we just have to start giving some respect to, because this was her 5th win in a row. Seems like she keeps improving and stepping up to the challenge with each subsequent stakes attempt. So she's right now arguably the leader among the 3-year-old fillies, just given the pretty muddled landscape that's out there. The others just don't have her resume, and they haven't run faster than her. So they'll have to step up and beat her moving forward. Staying on the dirt, the final stakes race that we'll discuss on the main track at the fairgrounds on Saturday was the Grade 3 Mine Shaft for the older horses, going a mile and a 16th. And Silver Dust, who won the Louisiana Stakes, the prep for this, but was disqualified later. He came back and won this race as well. mile and the 16th is just the right distance for this horse. He's got that nice high cruising speed where he can be up pressing the pace or stalking just off of it. And he made that quick burst of speed that he has at the quarter pole to the front. He got a little bit leg weary late. It wasn't the most visually impressive performance, as you would have expected him to go off and win this race for 3 or 4 lengths like he did the last time, but that's not what happened. It kind of got a little ugly in the late stages, but he still held on.
He did. He's just a little bit better than these other horses we're seeing in the older division in Louisiana. He got a 117 for the win, which is about what he normally runs. His race last time had actually come back a little slow. He only got a 111, but the 1-3 finishers from that race ran 1-2 here, with Gunnett getting a 115 in second. And basically this race is what it is. It's a grade 3. I don't see a lot of future in these horses moving up, but when you give Silver Dust an easy feel like this, he's just one that's going to get the job done most of the time.
Yeah, and Gunnett just doesn't want to change those leads. I mean, Ricardo Santana was leading left, leaning right, all over him, trying to get him to switch over to that right lead to get him a little extra burst of energy at the end, but he just didn't want to do it. But he's a horse that has some ability if he could ever figure out how to run straight. But yeah, I agree. This was not the strongest field, and Silver Dust is always a horse to me that feels like more of a miler type, and I just don't see him being a major player in the handicap division, especially as the distances stretch out moving forward. The highest speed figure that we saw on Saturday at the fairgrounds was actually turned in on the turf, as Factor This won the Grade 3 Fairground Stakes, leading the entire way on the rail. And that's important to note, because if you watched all of the turf races on Saturday at the fairgrounds, you noticed that they had taken the rails down, which had been up for most of the meet, those temporary rails, I mean. So the rail was set at 0 feet, and that fresh ground down towards the inside was really where you wanted to be. And Sean Bridgman just put Factor This right down there from the start, as seemed like was going to be the case once a lot of the speed scratched out of this race. And I mean, the only shocking thing to me was that people didn't gravitate towards this horse, because he looked like the lone speed, and they sent him off at 8-1.
Yeah, that surprised me. I know you had picked him on the forecast, and I jumped on board when I saw 8-1. I couldn't believe those odds. I wasn't surprised that Synchrony went off as the favorite, but some others taking more money than him was a bit surprising. And he ran very well. Got a nice 124 TimeformUS speed figure. He definitely took advantage of the rails. I think they had been at 25 feet, so it was at least a few passes of the rail were fresh and firm. And just it was the place to be on that turf course, no doubt about it. We saw it throughout the stakes races all day, and he took full advantage. But he's a good horse. He kind of had that questionable ride we talked about last time, where he was almost ridden like a rabbit for I forget the other horse.
Mr. Misunderstood, his stablemate.
Yeah. Yeah, for Brad Cox. But when things went his own way, he took full advantage and was an easy winner. And I did think it was a promising return for Synchrony. He hadn't run great his last 2 times last year, but even at his advancing age, he looked like his old self, and I expect him to be a player.
Yeah, I think this is a situation where the TimeformUS speed figures and the way that they award bonuses for horses that buck a pace trend really illustrates how well Synchrony ran, because he actually got a 127 TimeformUS speed figure, which is 3 points higher than Factor This is winning TimeformUS speed figure of 124, and I totally agree. Synchrony got back to his best form here. He was arguably best, even though he did ride the rail on the turns. He had to come off it in the stretch to try to make that rally after Factor This, and nobody else was accelerating like he was in the stretch. I mean, even that 51-1 shot, Botswana held off all the other closers for third. He was going nowhere in the stretch, but nobody else could close, and I just think that highlights how well Synchrony ran to get as close as to Factor This as he did at the end of the race.
Yeah, and you can see in our figures, if you look at the running line for Factor This, how he actually he was used a little bit to make the lead. The pace figures were 120 early, but he really backed it down down the back stretch to a 113. And that 7 points doesn't seem like a lot, but it really gave him a breather and was what allowed him to hold off Synchrony through the lane.
Let's move over west a little bit and talk about that Southwest card from yesterday at Oaklawn Park, beginning with that feature race, the Derby Prep, the Grade 3 Southwest. It's the second leg on that Arkansas path to the Kentucky Derby. And we had talked about the first race that they ran in this series, the Smarty Jones, last month. And we had talked about, due to the track condition and the way that the pace set up, it probably wasn't going to be a race that meant much moving forward. And I think that really was illustrated here, as Silver Prospector, the horse that just got the completely wrong trip in the Smarty Jones. His trip was much better, arguably a perfect trip in this Southwest, and he really delivered for Steve Asmussen.
He sure did. I think this wasn't a race that we talked about on the forecast being drawn on Monday. But as you said, we had both pointed out that we didn't think much of that race. But the one horse we did point to, if memory serves, was Silver Prospector. It's just having a no-hope trip. And he got the complete opposite of that here. I actually was on Twitter during the race, and going into the onto the backstretch, to me, it looked like it was his race to lose. He turned the tables and got a perfect trip. Now, I don't want to take too much away from him because he kind of made that trip. He made a quick move up in there to hold position and not lose too much ground while staying on the rail, was able to finish off the race. But both him and the runner-up, Wells Bayou, who set the pace and held on stubbornly for second, I thought ran really good races. They both got 119 Timeform US speed figures. It was a pretty big gap back to third, and Answer In, who I think wound up going off the favorite in here at 8-5, also for Brad Cox. He only got a 112, but this is the fastest prep we've seen from a 3-year-old so far.
Yeah, Silver Prospector, I mean, say what you will about his form coming into this, but these two ran objectively fast races, him and Wells Bayou. They really stepped forward here, and I'm not going to question it because this is the time of year when you see 3-year-olds taking big steps forward like this. So, I mean, I think it's totally plausible that they improved this much. And moving forward, I think Silver Prospector has to be considered a major player on this Derby trail. I do question him going farther distances a little bit because so far we've only seen him be effective going a mile, a 16th. Given that perfect trip that he got, I still thought he had a lot of trouble putting away Wells Bayou at the end of this race. Now, obviously, Wells Bayou ran a bang-up race to be second here, but it seemed like Silver Prospector was going to draw away at some point. He just got a little bit leg weary after making that burst to the front end at about the 8th pole. But these might just be two really nice horses. Wells Bayou, son of Looking at Lucky, he's got some turf route pedigree on the dam side, so I mean, he probably is not going to mind a little extra distance. Answer In was sort of the disappointment of this race. Well, he did run his career best Timeform US speed figure, and it's possible he just ran into a couple of superior rivals. He was pretty green through the stretch. He was ducking away from Javier Castellano's whip, just showing some tendencies that you don't want to see in one of these 3-year-olds in his 4th career start by now.
Yeah, the one thing I want to say about the speed figures, it was a really easy speed figure to make. There were plenty of routes on the Oaklawn card, including the last 5 races, I think were all 2-turn races, 4 of them at this exact distance. We're going to talk about a couple of them soon because they were other stakes races for older horses. So really easy speed figure to make, and this race was only a 1/100th of a second slower than older males ran the Razorback. So everything points to it being a good effort. I do have similar distance concerns as you do for the winner, and hard to say about Wells Bayou as well. I'm not sure he wants to go a lot further, but no doubt they both ran very well in here in my mind.
And let's talk about that other race at the same distance on that Oaklawn card on Monday. The Razorback won by Warrior's Reward, as you mentioned, just running 1/100th of a second, I believe, faster than the Southwest. Slightly different pace situation, though, as it seemed like there was a bit of pace on paper, but they basically let Warrior's Charge get to the lead in pretty moderate early fractions. He just controlled up front under Florent Giroux. He got a challenge in the stretch from Bankit, but he just had enough left to turn that horse away in the late stages.
Yeah, it was a bit of an ugly race going into the turn. There was some bumping and stuff, and I think maybe that led to the slowish pace. But yeah, Warrior's Charge hasn't done anything wrong since returning. He was a promising 3-year-old. He won some big races, big flashy figures at Oaklawn last year. He was our pace setter in the Preakness before finishing a good 4th that day with a nice figure. And you know, he's looked good this year. He showed some gameness. I do think he took advantage of the pace here. There was some trouble going into that first turn, as I mentioned, and but he just was able to hold off Bankit, who looked like he had his measure through the lane. He was able to dug in, and I think the first 2 ran pretty well in here. I'm curious what they're going to do with Bankit. I think he's a New York bred. I seem to remember him running in some of those races last year as a 3-year-old, and that might be easier pickings for him. It's hard to say. That's a pretty salty group in New York when you get in those older horses for pretty big purses. So not a huge step down, but I'm interested to see what they do with him because he's run very well, and I think he's really good up to a mile, even this mile and a 16th distance. But the one to watch is Warrior's Charge because in what's a pretty shallow older division, he certainly has some talent.
Yeah, I think it remains to be seen how far Warriors Charge wants to go. I know he was fourth in that Preakness, going a mile and 3/16. He set a pretty honest pace that day. Still, though, this was a mile and a 16th. We'll see if he can sustain real pace pressure and be a top horse. He's got to start running a little bit faster. I think the best speed figure he ever ran was in that Preakness, actually, when he got number in the low 120s back last May. But he's obviously heading in the right direction now. Bankit, I hope they turn him back to a one-turn race at some point. I've been saying this for a long time. I think he's better as a closing 7 furlong to a mile type horse. They've got plenty of those types of races for the New York breds. If they want to set their sights a little bit lower with him, I think he'd fit really well in those races against horses like Mr. Buff and Pat on the Back. So we'll see what they do with him, but I don't think he's going to be that competitive in some of these tougher graded stakes moving forward. The others, as you were saying, just not a whole lot of quality in this race, so they would all have to step up to still be competitive at this level a little bit later in the year. The last race we'll talk about from Oaklawn Park on that Saturday card was the Grade 3 Bayakoa for the fillies. This was really just a 2-horse race. Changed a little bit once Motion Emotion, who was one of the expected pace setters, failed to break sharply from the gate and then was rated after that. I think it forced the runner-up Woe Nelly to maybe move wide a little bit earlier than they would have preferred with her. Go Google your a tough name to say. Go Google yourself. She just sat the perfect trip, kind of like Silver Prospector in the Southwest, just sitting in behind a couple of speeds. She peeled out at the top of the stretch and wore down Woe Nelly.
Yeah, really the only surprise, they were the two to beat in here. I thought the surprise for me that it was Go Google Yourself wearing down Woe Nelly lead. Woe Nelly had come from way out of it off a really fast pace last time out to win the Pippin Stakes. But as you said, I think some of that had to do with that early move she made. I think she was actually last early and kind of moved right up to get the lead. Fought down inside. So pretty solid effort from these two. I think the winner got a 114. Woe Nelly got a 114 back in second. Mostly I wanted to point out this race because it was more than 3/5 of a second slower than we saw Silver Prospector run. So it just further kind of adds to the validity of that Southwest Stakes and how strong it really was. Not that these are Grade 1 fillies we saw here, but these are solid graded stakes performers.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you can make all those comparisons among the races. And also, I think we touched upon this, but the Southwest featured a much faster pace than these other two stakes races, and they still ran a final time that was one of the fastest that we saw on the card that day. So I do think that looks like a totally legitimate speed figure. Let's move on to Santa Anita. We'll discuss the Grade 2 Santa Monica, which was their feature race there on Saturday. Hard Not to Love, who was the winner of the Grade 1 La Brea from the end of 2019. She made her 2020 debut here in the Santa Monica, continued her winning ways. Just seems like John Sheriffs has her going in really great form right now. Overcame what was a pretty slow pace, just looked like a winner every step of the way and drew off with authority in the lane.
Yeah, she's gotten really good right now. She only got a 114 Timeform US speed figure for this win after a 124 last time. But as you alluded to, I think that was largely a function of pace. Lady Ninja went to the lead, but her pace figure was only a 97 after an opening quarter mile. So it's always going to be tough to get a big speed figure when you run that slow early. I'm not sure why they do that with the speed horse. It really doesn't work on dirt, particularly sprinting. You just keep the others with a better finishing kick in the race, and that was certainly Hard Not to Love. Mother ran decent to be second, but she was clearly second best in here. She was actually a little closer to that slow pace than Hard Not to Love, so no real excuses for her. She got a 108. Again, I'm sure she can run faster, but she wasn't going to run faster than Hard Not to Love.
Yeah, I'm curious about that La Brea speed figure because it came back such a fast race, and it looked legitimately so at the time. I mean, Bellafina ran really well in there, and she had run those types of 120 speed figures in the past. I do think it's probably circumstantial, though, that Hard Not to Love regressed a little bit in this race. As you mentioned with the pace, it's just not possible to run a really fast Timeform US speed figure when the pace is so slow in the early going, and you could see that by just looking at the pace figures for the first quarter of this race. So arguably she could have run faster. The final time figure was a 1:18, which would just be a 6-point regression from the La Brea. I think that's reasonable. So I'm not going to knock down that figure too much. And she just seems like a really nice horse, hard not to love. I'll be interested to see if they decide to keep her at sprint distances or stretch her out in the future. She's actually got a pedigree to go a lot longer than this. She's a half sister to Wonder Godot, believe it or not, who wanted to go about 1.25 miles. So I think they have options with this filly. She breaks a little bit slowly in these races. It didn't hurt her that much this time because the pace was so slow. As you mentioned, she could get right back into the race. We'll see if that hinders her in the future because you don't want to get too far back in these races, but she's just in really great form right now. On Sunday at Santa Anita, we saw a performance from a 3-year-old that got a lot of people talking, and I think for good reason. We talked about Bob Baffert unleashing a monster in Nadal about a month ago, and he's got another one, perhaps one that's a little better than that, as on Sunday in a 6-furlong maiden race, he unleashed Charlatan, who won his debut. It was just a 4-horse field, but there were a couple of nice runners who had done some good things already and earned some speed figures that suggested that this number that Charlatan ran was totally legitimate. I mean, just watching the race, it was plain to see this horse has a ton of ability, and I'm just excited to see where he goes from here.
Excuse me. Yeah, that was a very impressive performance. As you said, he actually didn't even go off the favorite in here. That went to Lane Way, who I believe was second in with Nadal last time, ran third with a 1:05 speed figure. The horse who eventually was the runner-up was Shooter Shoot, who had run a 98 speed figure last time out. So this wasn't some group of first-time starters that we didn't know what we had. They were pretty solid maidens, and he made them look like $10,000 claimers. He just toyed with this group. He ran fast. He wound up, it's going to get about a 122 TimeformUS speed figure for the effort, which is just huge. I mean, we talked about some horses running big figures last year. I remember Chancelot running a big one first time out. Saw some other fast numbers. Hidden Scroll, of course, I think ran a 120. Hasn't turned out very well for him since, but this horse just looked the part. He did it easily, was drawing away at the end. I am curious to hear what you think about his breeding. It did look a little sprinty to me, but I didn't dig too deep on the female side, and I'm sure they're planning on at least giving him a shot going long with this kind of talent.
Yeah, it's hard not to draw a lot of parallels between this horse and Justify. And it's funny, if you actually work out the math, considering that this year is a leap year, even though this horse debuted one day after Justify would have, it's actually the same number of days from Justify's debut until the Derby as it is from Charlatan's debut until this Derby. So it's been done before by Bob Baffert. If they ultimately do want to turn this horse into a Kentucky Derby type of horse, it's a long way out to speculate like that, though, because he only ran 6 furlongs. We don't know if he's anything more than a sprinter at this point. Obviously, his first 2-turn test will tell us a lot. And I assume that's going to be coming up pretty soon if they do target the Derby with this horse. As for his pedigree, again, you could draw a lot of parallels between this horse and Justify. Just like Justify's pedigree was pretty much speed over stamina. He was a scat daddy out of a really stamina-oriented female family. This horse is by Speightstown, who a lot of people think of as a sprint sire, but Speightstown is among the most versatile sires out there. He can get horses that go long distances on dirt or turf. He's the sire of a Travers winner, the sire of a Jockey Club Gold Cup winner. So Speightstown can definitely get horses to go route distances. And on the dam side, his dam was an excellent race mare, Authenticity. She was a multiple graded stakes winner on the dirt going route distances. She won the 1 1/8 Chuvy up at Saratoga. She was third in the Breeders' Cup Distaff. She placed in multiple grade 1 races very late in her career. I believe she got good as a 6-year-old for Todd Pletcher. So there is real stamina breeding on the dam side. I just think it remains to be seen what kind of horse this is and what kind of horse Bob Baffert thinks he is and what path they target for him. But based on this debut, he's one of the most exciting 3-year-olds that we have out there right now.
Yeah, I do want to mention Justify. I think on our figures in his debut got a 131, so it's not quite to that level, but it's basically the next step below. I can't remember a faster debut figure from a young 3-year-old than this one outside of Justify.
So one to definitely look forward to, and I'm sure we'll get some news soon about the path that they're plotting for Charlatan. Let's head over to Laurel Park, where they had a stakes-packed card on Saturday. We'll just discuss a couple of them. The feature there was the Grade 3 General George, and Firenze Fire was the heavy favorite coming in. His task got made a little bit easier once his main rival, Wicked Trick, scratched out. I believe he came up with a bout of colic for Linda Rice, so hopefully he's okay because he was in such good form in New York prior to that. But Firenze Fire just didn't really have any competition in this race, and if you looked at the TimeformUS pace projector prior to this race, might have been surprising to some to see that the pace projector had him on the lead in a slow pace situation. But when you look through the race, there was just a bunch of closers that he was running against, and Irad Ortiz did the right thing by putting him on the front end, and he just sprinted away from these horses in the lane.
Yeah, it looks like he's kind of getting a break from the Grade 1 competition. This is third time in a row against a little bit lesser horses, and frankly, he just has him over a barrel. He only got a 111 TimeformUS speed figure for this. I think a big part of that is the pace. The final time was actually a 120 in here. So, I mean, he was running through the lane. Nobody was going to catch him. With the scratch you mentioned, there wasn't a whole lot else to talk about in here, but sooner or later, I would assume we're going to see Firenze Fire jump back into deeper waters and try to get another Grade 1 win. And I mean, depending on the field he catches, he could certainly be a factor. We've seen him run well at that level before.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it still remains to be seen what distances they target with him, because he's been sometimes at his best going a mile, sometimes at his best going 6 furlongs. I believe this was his first win going 7 furlongs. It seems like everybody has a different opinion about what's the best path for this horse. But he's got a versatile running style. I agree. I think the 120 the 120 final time figure probably more in line with how I'd rate this performance, because it's just impossible to earn a high TimeformUS speed figure when you're going almost 47 to the half in a graded stakes race like this. You just can't. It's not physically possible to come home fast enough to earn a really high speed figure after you go that slowly in the early going. So we'll see if they target a tougher spot after this, but he's certainly capable of running faster when he gets more of a test.
Yeah, I was actually watching the stakes races from Laurel, and I thought maybe there was a strong headwind or something, because between this and the Fritchie, which we're not going to talk about because it was such a slow race, I just thought maybe it was a weather condition. But when I sat down to do the figures and looked at all the other races, there were plenty of quick fractions earlier in some of the other cards. So it was just a case of how the pace played out for this one and that Fritchie, which contributed to those low figures.
I mean, just compare the pace of this General George to the Miracle Wood that they ran for the 3-year-olds a couple of races earlier, where it was an insanely fast pace. And I think I'm going to highlight one of the trips in this race that I think everybody saw when I do my Horses to Watch segment this week, because Irad Ortiz gave a curious ride in that race. He rode Firenze Fire much better than the General George. But take a look at that Miracle Wood replay if you have a chance, because that was quite the wild trip for Dreams Untold. The one other race we're going to discuss at Laurel Park, though, from the Saturday card was the John B. Campbell going the 2 turns, the mile and the 16th earlier in the day. Pretty small field here, but a quality group. And it was nice to see Always Mining start to get back on track for Kelly Brubly. He looked so good as a 3-year-old, beating up on some lesser competition. Still hasn't really stepped forward from a speed figure standpoint, but he got the right kind of trip here, setting a pretty moderate pace. And if you're dueling to the wire with any one horse, I think you want it to be Monongahela, who just is a little bit camera shy.
Yeah, I wanted to point this race out. Always Mining. He ran well. It took him a little while to get going this year. I lost his first couple times out the end of last year, beginning of this year. But he's back to that good form he showed. He did the same thing early in his career. He lost, I think, his first 3 times out before he kind of went on a winning streak. And he looks to be doing that again. He got a 118 TimeformUS speed figure. Monongahela got his usual, whatever it takes to be second speed figure for the most part. And just the usual solid group of Maryland horses. Someday Jones ran 3rd with a 115, who had beat Always Mining earlier. One of the reasons I wanted to point out this race, this used to be a really big race in Maryland. I remember going and watching Broad Brush win this race live. He beat a New York horse, Proud Debonair, who was a hot horse at the time, and Little Bold John, who was a pretty famous Maryland-bred horse. So the Campbell's not what it once was, but it's still a pretty solid race. And these Maryland horses, we talk about them from time to time. They're just a really solid group, and they're running for some really nice purses.
No, that's totally true. From the sprinters up to these horses that want to go route distances on the dirt. We've seen some of them step up in some tougher graded stakes at other venues. Don't always win them, but they typically run well. So I think all of these horses could move on to some tougher spots in the future because they look like a pretty good group. Our final stop on this podcast will be to Tampa Bay Downs, where on Saturday they ran a couple of sprint stakes races topped by the Pelican for the older horses going 6 furlongs. And it was nice to see Killybegs Captain win this race for, I believe, the second year in a row. I think this was the race in which he beat Imperial Hint when he upset that horse last year as he was prepping for Dubai. And Killybegs Captain is a horse that I kind of have a soft spot for. I think people didn't fully appreciate how good he got last year because they kept running him in some really tough graded stakes races. I think he even picked up a couple of placings there. He ran well behind Promises Fulfilled a couple of times. He just got really good last year and didn't always pick up as many wins as they would have liked. But he got back here against Listed Stakes Company, and he just dominated this race and looked really good winning it.
He did. It was a very good effort. He got a 119. It almost matched the 120. He had run a couple starts back when he won the Grade 3 to Francis Dash at Laurel over some of those nice sprinters we were talking about. I was a little bit surprised he was 2-1 in here. I mean, He Hate Me, who just isn't very good these days, was actually the second choice in here at 3-1. And Mucho took some money, a horse who was actually one of the hot Derby horses, I think it was early last year. Maybe it was as a 2-year-old after he had run a good second in the Hopeful, but things just haven't panned out for him. He hasn't really improved at all since his 2-year-old season. So just a really nice effort from Killybegs Captain, and I think he's a horse that we're going to see showing up in some of these nice sprint stakes. I imagine he'll find his way back to New York, and he's a fun horse to watch. He runs a lot, and he seems to run his race most of the time.
Yeah, I imagine we'll see him in a race like the Carter, and with a lot of these sprinters going overseas at this point in the year these days, I imagine that'll be a good spot for him. So I'm very interested to see where he shows up next because he has gotten really good. The other sprint stakes that they ran at Tampa Bay on Saturday was the Minaret for the fillies and mares, and Ladies Island, who we've talked about before, has just been a total revelation since they claimed her for $16,000 back in late 2018. I believe since the claim, she's won 10 of 13 starts for these connections, and she just runs fields off their feet, opens up insurmountable advantages on the turn, and typically can hold on in the stretch.
Yeah, and that's exactly what she did here. She set a blazing pace, opened the big lead. Her opening quarter mile was a 1:45 TimeformUS speed figure. That can be dangerous when you get into better company because they're going to rate and give a bit stronger run toward the finish, but there were no such animals in here. She wound up with a 118, adjusted for the pace. The final time was only 109, but the pace was so quick we bumped it up 9 points, and she's just always going to be a factor when she faces these fillies. She's just so fast. She's going to be trouble for any other speed horse in the field, and it's just a matter of if the closers can catch her or not.
Yeah, she's one of these horses that's always going to look really good on the TimeformUS speed figures, but she's one that I'd want to be careful with moving forward because she's just one of these unrateable horses. It's not like she's ever going to set a slow pace and benefit from that situation. If you ever see a blue color-coded pace projector with her, I wouldn't put too much stock in that because she's just going to go out and run her fast fractions no matter who's in the race. She just opens up these big margins on her fields. She hasn't really gotten into a race with a really capable closer recently, and as you were saying, I think she'd be vulnerable in that kind of situation, but we just haven't seen it recently. The final race we're going to discuss on this podcast is also from Tampa Bay Downs, a non-stakes event, but on Friday on their card there, they ran an allowance race that just featured 5 horses. One of them dropped their rider at the start, so only 4 participated, but it was a pretty nice allowance field where I think all 4 horses have some potential. The top 2, though, are the ones that drew most of the focus, justifiably so, as Gouverneur Morris, who showed a lot of potential last year for Todd Pletcher, made his 3-year-old debut here and ran down Untitled, who was coming back on very short rest. I believe he just ran 2 weeks ago when he didn't have that great start in, I believe it was the Swale at Gulfstream Park. He tried 2 turns for the first time, but Gouverneur Morris, his experience edge gave him the upper hand here.
It did. Untitled was actually the favorite in that swale you're talking about before he kind of got banged around at the start and really lost all chance. So it wasn't like Gouverneur Morris. He probably didn't expect the connections probably didn't expect this kind of competition when they entered a Friday allowance race at Tampa. But he really had to do some running. Untitled, it was his first time around 2 turns. He set a moderate pace, but he was clear. And Gouverneur Morris really had to work to run him down. I was questioning if he was going to get there when they turned for home because it looked like Untitled had some left. You have to wonder if maybe Untitled is just more of a sprinter or if Gouverneur Morris was just good enough to run him down. Maybe it was a little bit of both. They both got 1:11 Timeform US speed figures for the effort. And what I thought was interesting with this race, the 4 who actually finished the race, the top 2 got 1:11s, the next 2 got 1:06s, and the top 2 both ran faster than anything we saw in either division of the winners, Risen Star. And all 4 of these got faster Timeform US speed figures than anything we saw in the second division of the Risen Star. So make of that what you will. But I thought it was a pretty nice effort from Gouverneur Morris. And I imagine he's going to jump in the stakes competition soon and the waters are going to get deeper. But I did like what I saw running down Untitled, who I think is a pretty darn good horse.
Yeah, and I do think it remains to be seen how far all of these horses want to go. I mean, the one that I think you could be most sure about is probably Gouverneur Morris. He's by constitution. He's a half-bred of Final Jeopardy, that Jason Service horse that we saw run in the Wood Memorial last year. He could go some route distances. So Gouverneur Morris seems like a pretty nice candidate to continue on to stakes events next. And it was good to see him improve his speed figure first off the layoff as a 3-year-old. So some nice things could be ahead for him. I'm a little bit less sure about how far Untitled wants to go. His pedigree, we just don't know a whole lot about it, because we're not really sure what kind of progeny Kozan, his sire, is getting. But he handled this first 2 turn test well enough. And I thought it was kind of funny that on last week's podcast, I know we were talking a little bit about Dennis's moment and how horses hadn't run back out of his Iroquois to really validate the speed figure. And just this week, we saw Let Me Know, who finished 3rd here, basically come back, first start back from the Iroquois and run a slightly higher speed figure. And we also saw Lebda, who was 3rd in that Iroquois, come back and win at Laurel Park with a respectable speed figure, surviving a very fast pace. So maybe some horses are finally flattering that Dennis's moment effort a little bit. We'll see him in the Fountain of Youth, I believe, in a couple of weeks. So looking forward to that one. But I agree, some nice efforts in this Tampa allowance race on Friday. That's all the racing this week. We'll be back, of course, again this Friday on the TimeformUS Forecast to handicap some races. I think it's a pretty slow week in terms of the stakes action. I haven't looked at the schedule yet, but I'm sure we'll scrounge up some races to talk about on that show on Friday. For now, remember, you can always listen to us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcasts, just subscribe to the Daily Racing Form and check us out each week on Tuesdays and Fridays. Thanks for listening this week, and we'll talk to you again on Friday.